The International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast, episode 9, Anthony Burgess in Malaya. I'm joined here at the International Anthony Burgess Foundation by Dr. Matthew Whittle of the University of Leeds. He's here to talk about Anthony Burgess in Malaya, specifically Burgess's writing on Malaya, including the Malayan trilogy. Matthew, I was wondering what the Malaya Burgess experienced was like generally, specifically for the British people over there. So what was the British role in Malaya at the time?
Yeah, so Burgess arrived in Malaya in 1954, and it was very much a Malaya of sort of anti-British sentiment in many ways. There was a kind of build-up towards independence and a rejection of British rule. Burgess was primarily in the country to work for the colonial service in that transition. So he was there to sort of teach at a school for the upper classes, who would then take over the reins of control of the country after independence. So yeah, it was very much a moment of transition that Burgess was responding to. It wasn't a very stable sense of sort of British dominance at that particular time.
And you mentioned the class of Burgess's students, but Malaya as a country was made up of many different, not just classes, but different races and different types of people. I mean, what sort of people was Burgess seeing while he was over in Malaya?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he called it one of the most sort of richly multicultural countries in the world, really. And he encountered a country which was, people by kind of a Malay indigenous population, but also by a large population of Chinese and Indian inhabitants as well that had been living in that country for decades. The Chinese population were primarily there to work on the tin mines, and the Indian labourers, some of whom were indentured by the British, were primarily there to work on rubber plantations. So there's these two big industries in Malaya that the British were controlling, and the British very much needed the wealth from those industries for its own sort of post-war reconstruction. But that also meant that there was lots of conflict between these different races within Malaya, especially as there was this move towards independence and a sort of uncertainty about what Malay independence would mean for the Chinese and the Indians.
With those divisions, there came sort of political insurgencies throughout the country, really. I mean, can you tell us more about that, really? I mean, what sort of politics was in play at the time?
Yes, this was also, it's worth seeing Burgess's position in Malaya in the mid-50s as very much in the context of the Cold War, I think, very much in that context of anxieties about communism and the battle between capitalism and communism that was raging on a global scale. Malaya was very much a part of that, of that wider fear of communism, and there was very much a Chinese insurgency of guerrilla warfare made up of Chinese communists that were sort of operating in the jungle, and they were trying very much to sort of secure power during this transitional period. And so you have this, the British established a state of emergency in Malaya in 1948, largely to try and protect its own interests in the region and to try and forestall the rise of communism. And so, yeah, you have this sort of sense of a multicultural society, but one which is very much inflected by these divisions and by these kind of different political ideologies which were very much dominating the post-war era across the globe.
I wonder if you could tell us what the difference between a protectorate, as Malaya was, and a colony.
Malaya it does have this quite unusual position within the British Empire. it was a protectorate in the way in which the British ruled through sort of via the hierarchy of sultans in the federated Malay states as they were known. So there wasn't that kind of direct rule that you get in places like India, for example. And I think in many ways that's one of the sort of advantages of approaching Burgess's writing on this region, is that Malaya itself was, or generally in terms of our engagement with British colonial history, isn't often considered. Certainly, you know, if we think of the sort of big colonies, if we think of this period of the end of empire, we often go to India, or we go to the colonies in Africa, for example, where these larger sort of maybe more forceful calls for independence and nationalism were taking place. Malaysia, doesn't quite have that same relationship to Britain, and so the move towards independence was much less violent, and not quite as well known to the British public, I think.
Okay, and this may be a question that is quite hard to answer, but is it possible to say how the British were viewed by the local peoples in Malaya? How were the British people viewed as a sort of ruling class, but also what was their reputation within the local population?
I think they were largely sort of aloof, and largely, I mean, they were generally, I think they were considered by many. There was that sort of colonization of the mind that you experienced, that a writer like Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about. That was very much a case, I think, in Malaysia, where there was that sense of a natural order, where white Europeans were sort of the kind of natural dominant class in many ways. And a writer like Burgess, he did try, and he did sort of socialise with the indigenous populations, and he did try to move beyond that, what he called the aloof club frequenting whites, and try and get to know the country. And many of the locals saw Burgess, or we can gather many locals saw Burgess as, in some ways, dirty, or in some ways sort of lowering himself by trying to engage with that wider population.
Well, there's that famous quotation in Little Wilson and Big God, I think it is, where he reports that the locals said to him, "You are despicable because you drink with us, and we are despicable." Which
absolutely, I think that says a lot about that colonized mindset, which was very much during that period of the end of empire. There wasn't certainly in Malaysia that sort of firm rejection of the British necessarily, but there was within the ruling elite and within those that would then take on government, there was still very much a sort of anti-British sentiment as well. So those two trajectories were sort of working at the same time that Burgess was there, I think.
In Britain at the time, the British population didn't really find out a lot about life in Malaya specifically, but the Far East in general. Their views were mainly formed through literature, through fiction. Can you sort of say why that was?
I mean, we don't have too much. So the record of how the British operated in places like Malaysia is very sketchy, and I mean, part of that is due to a sort of British sense that there was this sort of greater Britain out there beyond the borders of the actual, of the United Kingdom itself, but not much direct sort of engagement with what the different interactions with non-British nations actually involved, and actually sort of how they operated. At the same time, during the 1950s, as Britain was relinquishing the colonies and all over the empire, and different places were gaining independence, roughly between sort of 1948 to 1965 is the most is the period when there's kind of the highest, most extensive levels of decolonisation. During that period, the Colonial Office were, in fact, burning large swathes of documents and setting bonfires, creating these bonfires where documents were burned or documents were placed in kind of weighted crates and dumped by the Navy out into the middle of the ocean, largely to try and, it was called Operation Legacy. So that's kind of a view to how the British Empire would be viewed by future generations and to try and save the embarrassment of the government during that transitional period. So we have very little record of what life was like in places like Malaysia, and that's one of the reasons why sort of the literature of these former colonial servants, as Burgess was, is quite important for getting a sense of British engagements with these nations, I think.
Okay, and while we're talking about Burgess, I think it's really important to paint a picture of who else was in the Far East and writing about the Far East before Burgess, and who would have sort of influenced Burgess's writing, whether positively or negatively, when he was writing his Malayan trilogy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a whole sort of tradition of writing Malaysia that Burgess sort of saw himself as joining that tradition, but also as writing against that tradition in many ways. I think that he saw himself as part of a longer line of writers, potentially starting maybe with someone like Rudyard Kipling. Burgess famously quoted the poem Mandalay on the way out to Malaysia in 1954. Also writers who he very much admired, like Joseph Conrad, and slightly later W. Somerset Maugham. And so he saw himself as fitting into that tradition, but I think what you find when you read texts like the Malayan Trilogy is that he's very conscious, he's very, very self-aware in these texts of his place within that tradition. And he's very much, there are many allusions to someone like Maugham, for example, and he sees himself as doing something which is radically different from those writers. He sees himself as very much a writer who has got to know Malaysia much better than someone like Conrad or someone like Maugham, someone who's spent time with the locals, someone who has learnt the language and can actually record this sort of teeming multicultural world, as he called it, in a way that those writers weren't able to because they were restricted by their own sort of Eurocentric viewpoint. They were restricted by their experience purely of the bridge playing club houses. And so, yeah, the Malayan Trilogy is self-aware of its place within that tradition, but also very much trying to sort of move beyond that tradition, I think.
When talking about Burgess's experiences in Malaya, it's quite difficult because really the only source we have that refers to Burgess in Malaya is Burgess himself in his autobiography or his many piece of journalism about his experiences in Malaya. It makes learning about what Burgess got up to in Malaya quite difficult. So what do we know of Burgess in Malaya?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. I think it is. I mean, as anyone who encounters Burgess's writing, he's very much always sort of creating this narrative of, and there's a lot of sort of discussion over how much of the material in his autobiographies, for example, is fictionalized. I think it was once, his autobiographies were once called his greatest novels. Is this that sense of a writer who is very aware of narrativizing his life, but also, different stories crop up and different versions of events crop up throughout his career. So it is difficult to get a sense of the sort of truth behind what Burgess's account of Malaysia. And one of the only records we do have are his novels on that period. And we know from photographs that the Burgess Foundation has that that he met various people, kind of British people, but also made friends with indigenous Malay population through his teaching. There's the car, of course, the kind of famous car that Victor Crabbe is very much a central part of the story of Victor Crabbe in the Malayan trilogy. We have photos of Lynn, his first wife, with this automobile. But yeah, we don't really have very much in terms of what the actual reality of his experiences were, I don't think.
In terms of Burgess's own opinions of his own experiences, seeing as that is all we have really. I mean, what was his take on his job in Malaya, for example, at Malay College especially? Yeah.
So I think that's it. He was, as we said, he was teaching very much the kind of upper class Malay community. In the novels, the history teacher Victor Crabbe, who is sort of, we can read as a kind of fictionalized version of Burgess himself. Victor Crabbe teaches at a school which is populated by Malay, Indian and Chinese students. And that's largely to create within the text themselves a sort of microcosm of multicultural Malaya and through the very school setting. But that wouldn't have been the case, that these schools would only have taught an upper class Malay community. So we get a sense of, I think, Burgess, who saw himself on the one hand as being very much, as we said, sort of insinuating himself within the culture and learning the language and wanting to get to know the locals. But on the other hand, we get a sense of a writer who is wanting to almost sort of import high Western culture as well. Someone who saw his role within the colonial service as being able to pass on the best that has been thought and said in that kind of Arnoldian tradition, that Burgess was very much an admirer of Matthew Arnold, and he saw his role as passing on high culture to the Far East through, as a lover of classical music, for example. He wanted to sort of pass on a love of classical music, and he would hope, he did write a symphony to celebrate Malay independence, and was, in his own writing, describes being sort of that the rejection by the government of that symphony, that they didn't want to use it, and that sort of hit him quite hard, I think. So yeah, he saw himself as the bestower of a high culture.
One part of Burgess's experiences that we know next to nothing about is the experiences of Lynn, his first wife, who he took to Malaya, and who was perhaps not the happiest of expatriates while she was there. I mean, what do we know about Lynn's experiences?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we do get a sense that she found it quite difficult in Malaya. Was certainly, I think there are some letters, again, in the Burgess Foundation archive, of Lynn writing to her family, and there's a sense of sort of very much a sense of homesickness that we get from Lynn's accounts. And she, again, just as Burgess sort of fictionalizes himself in the figure of Victor Crabbe, we almost get a fictionalized version of Lynn in the figure of Fenella Crabbe in the Malayan trilogy. And Fenella is very much a character who sort of does invest in the idea of the exotic East, and wants the Far East to be this romantic place that she's read about in anthropology and in popular fiction, and yet the reality is completely different. It's very much a reality of Fenella anyway describes it as a reality of sort of scorpions and beggars and things. So,
but also isolation from other people. Other British people as well. There's a scene in the novel where Fenella tries to go to a film club as a sort of last-ditch attempt to have a social life, but it's sort of an ill-fated trip. She never makes it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And she has an affair with a local Indian man as well, so there's that sense of, sort of loneliness in the what was called the Memsabib, the female British females who were out there with their husbands, and then that sort of character, that figure of the sort of lonely, isolated female crops up in not only the Malayan trilogy through Fenella, but also in Beard's Roman Women as well. It gets referred to. And so it is something that Burgess was quite attentive to and returned to in different ways, I think, throughout his career.
Malaya is really the place where Burgess became a writer. He had written a novel during his time in Gibraltar during the war, but that was a novel that wasn't published until the mid-60s. The Malayan trilogy, Time for a Tiger, the first of the Malayan trilogy, was his first published novel. What do you think the fiction that Burgess writes in Malaya tells us about both Burgess as a writer and his experiences of Malaya?
Yeah, I think it is very much the moment when he obviously arrives on the literary scene and starts this huge career. You know, he would eventually publish over 30 novels. But yeah, you're right, Time for a Tiger, his debut novel, is sort of where he finds his voice a little bit more. As you say, he'd already written A Vision of Battlements based on Gibraltar, and I think he'd already written Worm in the Ring as well, where, again, two novels which he'd attempted to be a writer and they weren't published. Heinemann had turned around and said, no, you need to go back and try again. So Time for a Tiger is very much where, he starts to find his voice. And it's an odd novel because, it doesn't really have too much of a plot necessarily. It's more of a series of episodes. But it's where he starts to discover a particular tone. I think he says when he thinks back to the writing of that novel that he saw himself as a very somber, gloomy writer, but when he actually came to write that text, he discovered that he had this quite darkly comic tone. And that's a tone that he definitely takes with him throughout his whole career. And there's a sort of dark comedy to all of his novels, I think.
And how do you think Burgess's writing changes throughout the Malayan trilogy, especially in that sort of isolated 2-year period?
Yeah, so the Malayan trilogy he writes, obviously Time for a Tiger published in 56, and then the two other installments published in 58 and 59. And there is almost a sense of, whilst he retains this sort of comic tone, there's more of an engagement with the serious issues of the end of empire, and more of an engagement with what that means for British identity. So you find over the course of the trilogy itself that some of the themes get a bit more serious. He starts to deal with the rise of America, for example, and starts to depict the influence of American power on Malaya as something as potentially quite nefarious, in the fact that there were no sort of American boots on the ground, so to speak, but America was finding its way into this newly independent nation through popular culture. And again, popular culture is something that throughout his career he's very much something he's very wary of. The power of popular culture to sort of find its way into the beds of the East through the back door, through jukeboxes, through films. And he starts to see that as forestalling the creation of a genuine, authentic Malay culture that he was trying to help. He was trying to help the Malays to find a way to articulate their own cultures through music and the like. And he saw Americanization as potentially stopping that, I think.
But also in terms of the writing, generally the style of the writing throughout the Malayan trilogy, do you think that he becomes more confident as a writer even within this short space of time?
Yeah, definitely. I think he certainly, the success of Time for a Tiger naturally sort of gives him that extra confidence, and to see himself as part of this tradition of Kipling and Conrad and Maugham. And he strongly believes that this body of literature that he leaves in terms of the Malayan trilogy is a sort of genuine reflection of what life was like during this post-war period in Malaya. And I think that the very style of the writing reflects that in terms of the drawing of different characters. The sort of, you move from Time for a Tiger through to Enemy in the Blanket and Beds in the East, and the trilogy becomes much more panoramic. I think he's able to present lots of different interlocking and interweaving stories in a much more confident and much more kind of engaging and exciting and interesting way, I think.
And of course, Malaya doesn't just leave that small impression on him. It sort of infected all of his fiction to an extent. So you have references to Malaya most overtly in Earthly Powers. There's a large section of Earthly Powers that's set in Malaya and largely based on Somerset Maugham's experiences in Malaya. Malaya also infects perhaps his most English of novels, Nothing Like the Sun, which is the story of Shakespeare's love life, but Malaya is central to that novel.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's right. I think Malaya sort of being such a formative part of the creation of Anthony Burgess, the writer. You're right, he doesn't quite leave it behind. He returns to it imaginatively throughout his career. And like say, you have texts like Nothing Like the Sun, which is kind of couched as this lecture to a Malay audience. And it's really where he's a writer who, I don't think he's got the reputation for doing so, but if you look at the influence of Malay on his writing, he's a writer who's very much interested in race, I think. He's interested in racial identities. And that comes probably from that engagement with the different sort of conflicting races they discovered in Malaya, where after that point he starts to return to it, not only in Nothing Like the Sun, where he depicts Shakespeare as having an Eastern, non-white lover, but also in a text like The Right to an Answer as well, which is set in the Midlands, but is very much about this relationship between a British expat who returns home and a Sri Lankan immigrant who moves to the Midlands, and very much about those race relations that were occurring not only in Malaysia as he encountered it, but when he returned home in the late 50s, he discovered a very different Britain that was undergoing changes in terms of mass immigration and in terms of very violent reactions against immigration. And so he's a writer who, through his different texts, I think, tries to articulate a view that immigration to Britain is because of the history of colonialism, but also tries to address those issues in the ways that says, well, actually, British identity can change and can become more open and progressive and can include non-white people from Britain's former colonies. It doesn't have to be this static sort of idea of whiteness being a single marker of Britishness, I think.
This podcast was produced and recorded at the International Anthony Burgess Foundation by the Foundation's Graham Foster and Dr. Matthew Whittle of the University of Leeds.